Hello, welcome everyone. This is the second Critical Mixed Race Studies Association book series event. My name is Kelly Jackson, and I am the elected Vice President of CMRS. To learn more about CMRS and sign up for our listserv, if you haven't already, please go to criticalmixedracestudies.com. I would like to first acknowledge with deep respect that Arizona State University, where I work, and the city of Phoenix, where I reside, occupy the ancestral homelands of American Indian tribes, including the Accomal O'odham, Peepash, and Tohono O'odham peoples. On behalf of the CMRS board, we are excited to continue our book series events leading up to our renowned conference, which will now be held virtually in February 2022. We will be sending updated information about the conference next week, so please stay tuned. As for the structure of our talk today, the first segment will feature a conversation between three contributing authors of the new release book, Multiracial Experiences in Higher Education, Contesting Knowledge, Honoring Voice, and Innovating Practice from Stylus Publishing. Then for the last 20 minutes or so, the talk, we will answer your questions that you submitted through the Q&A. For now, please consider introducing yourself in the chat by stating your name, where you are tuning in from, and your interest in this topic. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Charmaine Wujasinger is a consultant and author who addresses issues of social justice, racial and social identity, intersectionality, and conflict resolution. Her professional background includes positions as staff associate to the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs and Assistant Ombudsman at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Dean of Students at Mount Holyoke College. Charmaine served as volume editor or co-editor for 5 volumes addressing race, identity, and social change, including 2 editions of New Perspectives on Racial Identity Development, the forthcoming book, The Complexities of Race, Identity, Power, and Justice in an Evolving America, and the book that we are discussing today, Multiracial Experiences in Higher Education. Charmaine's 1992 dissertation presented one of the first models of multiracial identity, a model I proudly draw from in my own scholarship. Our second speaker is fellow CMRS board member, Dr. Nalia Kaya, who is an associate professor at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She previously served as the coordinator for multiracial and Native American Indigenous student involvement at the University of Maryland, where she also created a multiracial leadership course and continues to facilitate TOTA's spoken word experience. Nalia identifies as a poetic public sociologist, centering her energy on the intersections of art and activism. She organizes arts programming in her role on our board, and Nalia is an alumni of Shoreline Community College, Hampton University, and George Mason University. And finally, our third speaker is Nick Davis, who is a storyteller, cook, gardener, and consultant, who is committed to creating experiences that deepen and transform our relationship to community, the earth, and our collective imaginations. A native of Inglewood, California, he's been based in Chicago for the better part of a decade. Nick's work has evolved building out programs designed to develop strong youth organizing networks, helping formerly incarcerated youth navigate the inequities of reentry, and empowering communities to take control of their access to healthy, fresh, and affordable food. Nick studied sociology at Northwestern University, where he was heavily involved in student organizing, developing hydroponic, aquaponic systems, and president of Mixed, Northwestern's Mixed Race Student Coalition. Welcome, panelists. And now I will turn it over to Nalia, Dr. Kaya.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're at. I want to start off by also acknowledging that I am on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank and the Piscataway. Of course, recognizing the land we're on, we need to go much further than that, right? So that's just the beginning of the work that many of us need to do. And so I want to acknowledge that these should not just be symbolic recognitions of the land we're on, but that we should also be engaging with the communities and working in solidarity with for those of us who are not from these communities. So thank you so much, Kelly, or Dr. Jackson, if we're being formal, for giving us that wonderful welcome. So I want to start off by kind of asking my colleagues, as a way of supplementing that wonderful introduction, could you also share how you yourself relate to multiracial topics and multiraciality? Maybe Nick, do you want to take that first?
Sure, thank you so much, Nalia, and I'm really happy to be here. I think that my relationship to multiraciality and this subject is a little bit of a messy one, and that's why I kind of appreciate the opportunity to flesh that out in narrative form, and we can kind of dive into that a little bit later in the talk. I identify as a Black man, you know, my family history is complicated and windy and all these other things, but that's kind of where I've landed, and that's what you'll see in this kind of cross section of my life. I am also based in Chicago on the ancestral lands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the Council of Three Fires, just to contextualize that, as well as a lot of other groups of folks who kind of come in passing and in and out and do that trade work. And I really appreciate kind of centering our conversation with land acknowledgement as well, Nalia and Kelly. And so I guess I'll pass it over to Charmaine if you want to take it from here.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I live right outside of Albany, New York, and so I'm on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican and Haudenosaunee people. When I think of multiracial topics, given my age, I think someone gave me the lovely image of bookending. So in terms of scholarly work, it began in the late 80s and early 1990s was the first bookend that, because of my research and my dissertation research, and because there were not that many models at the time or people doing that kind of work, I augmented my consulting work and general diversity topics with a lot of work on multiracial identity, going out to colleges and universities, parents groups, student groups to do that kind of work. After about 15 plus years, I began to question some of the frameworks that formed how we thought about identity and some of the larger questions about power and privilege. And so my scholarship really moved away from multiracial identity per se to adapting my own models to incorporate more on intersectionality and power and privilege. And what I like about the Multiracial Experiences in Higher Education book, it provided this other bookend to a career that is somewhat winding down, although it's not over, to engage with so many new scholars and so many new ideas. In a way, it was like coming home to family, but the family's grown a lot. And so I really appreciated the conversation, the ability to engage in conversation and dialogue with so many new people. So that's how I situate myself. And it may come up in the presentation. I'm a multiracial person who didn't always identify that way. And people can ask me about that if they like wish in the chat box, it might come up. But I currently identify as multiracial. I have Asian and white ancestry.
Thank you, Charmaine and Nick. So just to give everyone a bit of background on myself, if you're not familiar, so I identify as mixed generally, but I identify as MENA population, Middle Eastern North African, and white. So similar to Charmaine, a background of European and Asian descent, though they are from different spaces. And I too kind of didn't really know where I fit in growing up. And I'll get into the complexities of being MENA and what that means when they still won't disaggregate us. And we'll talk about that complex history in just a bit. So I want to start off by kind of talking about, so the book reveals, of course, that we all have this very broad range of identities, experiences, and backgrounds in higher education as multiracial people. And it also highlights like the complexities and the nuances, as I just kind of hinted at. And so with the first segment, kind of going to our subtitle of the book, the first part, how do your experiences or your work with multiracial topics contest knowledge? So maybe I'll throw that to Nick first.
Absolutely. So my experience with kind of dealing with the body of knowledge that exists, that kind of CMRS set up, was I was first introduced to concepts around multiraciality probably around my freshman year of college, and when I got a little bit more involved with the organization at my school that was created actually the year that I entered college, the Mixed Northwestern's Mixed Race Student Coalition. That was my first time really contending with multiracial identity. Right after that, I was introduced to the Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference, which was in Chicago that year at DePaul. I believe it was like 2014 or 2015. And what I started learning was that the kind of the boxes that I had been put in my entire life, and the kind of racial logics that I had to navigate my entire life were not as established and not as real and not as cemented in as I had originally thought. And I think after kind of getting jolted from that, and I can talk about that a little bit more later, I started to realize that there were all these ways that I could kind of push back on that knowledge. At USC a few years later at the CMRS conference out there, my friend Mandy and I ended up presenting at a conference. We had done a series of interviews that was kind of a mess with all of these different leaders of different multiracial organizations across the nation in different universities, and kind of just told their stories and talked about the similarities and underlying issues that a lot of folks had to deal with. And I found that just putting the narrative out into the world, a lot of people were able to latch on to that and to say, yes, wait, that's me. And that is contesting the knowledge that I've been told about myself my entire time moving through higher education. And so a lot of what I am doing is honestly just being a witness in a lot of ways, and kind of giving testimony in a lot of other ways that other people can latch onto and then kind of evolve from there. But, not doing too much in the, I would say my realm of writing isn't so much in the academic field per se, but it's this kind of storytelling field where people can kind of see themselves in these stories. And in that way, I think it's been a really powerful, that's been a very powerful avenue for contesting knowledge.
Thank you so much, Nick. Charmaine, could you share as well?
Yeah, sure. I loved how much Nick talked about storytelling, because in a way, I'll bring the book into some of what I'm talking about. The book centers narratives as a way of presenting knowledge. And I think in higher education, at least I see it in so many ways, what is considered knowledge and what is considered relevant and what's considered legitimate, not always accepts or values stories. And then particularly of people who are students and people who are staff, as well as folks who are faculty. But before I talk about contesting knowledge, I think one thing I'd like to make clear is with the book, and I think with our work and the idea of multiracial topics, I feel that they contest the dominant narrative that is based in white supremacy, because sometimes it can be seen as we're contesting other racial groups, we're competing with other marginalized racial groups. And what I believe we are not doing, or at least I would hope not, and I don't think the book does, it is we question the dominant white ideology and narrative in many ways. So what is considered knowledge? What is considered theory? How, at the same time, we have to work within the same topics that have been given to us, like the concept of identity, the concept of race, the concept of racial categories. And a number of people talk about that in the book, about the dilemmas. We're walking that line of adopting the language because that's the language we've been given. And that's what the language that kind of grounds a lot of this, but also thinking about how do multiracial topics, how do our own experiences, how does theory and research cause us to rethink those things? And then how do we expand on that? So the idea of identity being over the course of a lifetime, being fluid, that's one of the ways that we can test knowledge. But I also want to talk about, I know that you both contributed narratives to the book. So I'm going to go back to the idea of narratives at some point when we move to the second part of the title about honoring voice and honoring multiple voices. What the book does, it's faculty, staff, and students in a variety of settings with a variety of identities. How do we honor voice in the book, and how does that actually build knowledge, but also contest the idea that knowledge can reside in individuals that further inform much bigger concepts of like identity and power and privilege. So I think that's what the other thing is the book talks about higher education. And I think it makes clear that higher education we consider is a contested space. And then the idea of being contested does not, to me, mean we have to fight everything. Being contested, for me, contested means rethink, reevaluate, build upon, don't just accept. But contesting something means it's a positive force because of the centuries of white supremacy that have built what we currently have. And I think Reg Daniels does a lovely job in the forward talking about the centuries of legacy that has brought us to this point, and how our experiences, our writing, our research, our living contests that narrative and those systems that constrain us.
Thank you so much for that, Charmaine. I just want to, for anybody that's just joining us, we are recording this. So just so if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your camera when you're asking questions and so on. For myself with contesting knowledge, I think I've finally gotten to a space where I actually feel comfortable with my own identity, which has been complicated for a very long time as somebody who has a parent from another country that I was not raised with. I do not speak the same language as my family. And so I've really started to focus in on Middle Eastern and North African populations and how did we come to be categorized as white and the problem of being still categorized as white. And so a lot of that for me is about kind of educating folks and contesting this idea of whiteness. So how did we come to be labeled that way had to do with anti-Asian sentiments and immigration laws. And so what was happening at the time, people, you know, of course, they were using labor from a lot of East Asian countries in the US at the quote unquote end of slavery. And people were looking to have cheap labor. And so as you can imagine, a lot of the same things that we hear today, you're taking our jobs, you're bringing disease, you're doing this, you're doing that. And so you had very restrictive act, kind of specifically thinking about like the Chinese Exclusion Act. And at the time, immigration was only open at first to people who were considered free white persons. Later, that was extended to, quote, aliens of African nativity. And I had the rest of that quote, and persons of African descent. So obviously, there were a whole bunch of people that did not apply to, so you had no rights, you could not, you know, own land, property, and so on. And so there were numerous court cases brought by quote, folks from Asia. Dow versus United States was the one where a Syrian immigrant finally won the case and it stayed. So there were other people that had overturned cases, but then later it was, nope, you're not white anymore. And so you can see in White by Law, there's an appendix and it just goes back and forth. You're white, you're not white, you're white, you're not white, right? And each time you become not white, you lose all your rights again, right? And so the Syrian case was really the one that kind of set the separating of Asia and putting folks under this white category. It didn't really mean it was more about performing whiteness, I should say. So people's arguments were around, we're Christian, we're hard workers, we're good people, we're from the Caucasus region, and you say Caucasian, right? All these types of any argument they could make to get citizenship. And so I really contest the idea of us still being labeled under that category, particularly on the census, because of funding, because it conceals racism. You know, if a police report for a hate crime would be taken, it would literally say a white person and a white person if it was a white person perpetrating, right? If somebody was profiled by the police, it's going to say white person, right? And so there are just so many problems with that, particularly after 9/11. And so I think it is very important that we do get that disaggregated on the census, and hopefully others will follow suit. NCORE, I was very happy to see, has already done that, and Critical Mixed Race Studies has done that for a while. And so that was one of the first places I felt validated, was coming to a CMRS conference and being like, my category is finally listed correctly. So that's a bit about kind of the space and knowledge that I contest a bit in my chapter. So I'm gonna kind of throw this over to Charmaine.
Yeah, actually, before we move to narrative and honoring narrative, I thought of one of the things that you were speaking. I think one of the ways my work contested knowledge was I developed an ecological theory, which I didn't know that's what it was back in the day. I was supposed to come up with a stage model because that's who I was working with. The school I was studying at did stage models. I thought I was supposed to do the stage model on multiracial identity. Unfortunately, my data did not take me there. And so one of the ways I think my initial work contested knowledge was I didn't know what to do. And I suddenly realized it highlighted factors that influenced how people chose an identity over the course of their lives, which could change. And so that was an ecological model, which I didn't know that's what it was at the time. So, and I also see people now moving into intersectional models and other forms of framing knowledge and framing identity that is so exciting. So in terms of honoring voice, which is the second subtitle of the book, because you both contributed narratives, I want to encourage or invite you to think about how do those voices, whether it's something from the book or something that you want to add to what's in the book, how does that honor knowledge? How does it honor multiracial experiences? I'll let either one of you jump into that.
Okay, I can take this one. So I really appreciated being invited to share my story within this, from the context of it being a narrative, because going back and reading this book has been a process that has kind of spanned over a couple of years now. And when I go back and read this, because I did have to go back and read this wasn't something that was necessarily like just fresh in my mind or something I had just written. I found points within my own narrative where I would have questioned myself or written differently or prodded at something or asked myself to dig in a little bit deeper somewhere. And there's some parts that were a little bit uncomfortable to read. And I think what I realized was that my story was not necessarily, the most articulate or the most academic or the most or even just like the best writing, but what it was it was honest, and it was gentle, and it was where I was at that cross section in my life and the story that I wanted to tell. And I think what narrative allows us to do is it allows us to hold all of those messy aspects of identity and all of the histories and the different lineages, and tell that and deliver that in the way that feels right to us, and have it received with all of that messiness. And I think what happens when we are asked to kind of take our identities and make them compact and put them into this kind of checkbox is that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, but really what it is we're trying to take all of these like disparate pieces of our story and stuff them into that box, and convince ourselves that feels right. And I think what this allowed me to do was to tell my story in an honest way, put it on paper and put it out into the world, even if my story is changing and is dynamic over time. what people are going to look at is they're going to look at something that was real. And I think in that way, that really contests knowledge. I think that narrative, especially like messy narratives, are not always valued in academic spaces necessarily, and to have this sandwich in between kind of theory and practice and say that this matters just as much was really important to me. I think also what I think is important to put out there is that a lot of times what these systems of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy try to do is they try to put you in this box so they can say, you know, we understand how we can relate to you, we understand how we can subjugate you in a lot of ways. And instead of doing that, I'm saying, here is all of it. You have to deal with all of these things and figure out how to make a decision about me based off of all of those factors. And I think that if folks were, if, you know, we greeted each other and instead of being able to quickly identify race and gender, and if we didn't introduce each other with just, you know, job titles and PhDs and all these other things, what is it, when we strip away all of those things, what is it that we're left with? And I think that a lot of times what we're left with is our stories. And what I would prefer, I've thought over and over and over again, even just like submitting a bio to something like this, right? Do I say all of my past achievements that fit, that make me look like, you know, I have all these accolades according to, you know, one way of understanding like knowledge and accomplishment? Or do I talk about the fact that I'm really interested in the way that you know, certain types of birds all flock together and can move in conjunction with each other without communicating with each other? Or that I'm fascinated with the way that, you know, cloth falls on different bodies in different ways and all these different things. It's like even just beyond, I think what narratives can do and the way what we can express through narratives can kind of blow up all of these ideas of what it means to kind of be a person in society as well. And so anyways, I feel like I've spoken for a while, but that is one of the reasons, or many reasons, that I think that narrative is really imperative to have in terms of knowledge building, and why I was so grateful to be able to tell my story in this book.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really relate to what you're talking about. I think as a first generation college student, you know, for me, I always had kind of that, you know, imposter syndrome and thinking I'm never going to publish in big journals. I'm more, you know, want to do arts and communicate with my community and do community-based programming. And, you know, when you're in grad school, it's like that, at least during my time, that wasn't really supposed to be your goal, right? You're supposed to be trying to publish in these peer-reviewed things. But I just want to say that by following my own path, it's just so amazing the spaces it has led me to and the opportunities. And now it's kind of funny seeing the reverse, where academia is now like trying to snatch all us artists, like, yeah, come do stuff. And oh, now there was a poet at the inauguration. All right, poets. And, you know, it's just funny to kind of see how if you stay true to your own story and you honor yourself and your path and your voice, that things come around. And so I think I was trying to honor voices in a few ways. First, as Nick said, I felt honored to get to be offered a space and to be asked to share a story that I had shared verbally for a long time, but it's honestly been something for like 10 to 15 years that I was still scared to write about, and only presented at NCORE like 2 years ago. And so it was something extremely personal to, you know, get down to my story. I really like this quote by C. Joy Bell, and that's another piece I hope I was doing, is like combating deficit-based perspectives about multiracial people. You know, that we have problems, we're confused, we're, you know, anti-monoracial connection, you know, all of those things. And it says, I am not an incompletion of all these races, but I am a masterpiece of the prolific. I am an entirety. I am not a lack of anything. Rather, I am a whole of many things. And that's been part of learning for me to navigate in many spaces. And rather than feeling an outsider, realizing that I'm whole in all of those spaces. It's just, you know, that oftentimes we focus on the negative of what we aren't, or so on. Another part is just creating projects and spaces for voices. I've been hearing every time that I've spoke about MENA experiences, somebody will pop up and say, oh, finally, somebody talked about my experience. I feel acknowledged. Thank you. This is important. I've been siloed. I've felt alone, and nobody understands why this matters. So that's another part, trying to honor and create spaces for others. And then another part was trying to create a both and perspective. And Nick's chapter really struck that for me, where as what was kind of touched on before by Charmaine, sometimes multiracial spaces are seen as divisive, as in opposition to other communities. And we can be both a part of our multiracial communities, but as Charmaine mentioned, we're all fighting against white supremacist structures. And so we should also be addressing anti-Blackness, anti-Asianness, right? Like, we should be in solidarity with one another and not seen as conflicting with one another. And so that's another thing that I hope that I do, and that I'm able to honor, all of our experiences by being in solidarity with one another.
And I'm just going to add to that. Both of you, thank you for sharing more of your story here in a narrative voice. And having been editor with Mark Johnson Guerrero of the manuscript, I love how the different voices and the different stories are told in different ways. So it's interesting to go back, Nick, as you talked about looking back and what I may have said differently or in a different voice, if they're perfect the way they are. I think one of the persons who reviewed the book for us said that they're both perfect and complicated, perfect and imperfect. And Nick had said to me, before we go off of the narrative piece, Charmaine, make sure you say something about yourself. So my narrative has been greatly affected by the passage of time. As I believe I'm the oldest person on this conversing group. And so when Mark and I told part of our stories at one of the introductory chapters, I talked about having to check a paper form to register my dissertation. And I said, for the first time, I had checked 2 boxes on that form. And what Mark's kind of put out, which I hadn't even thought, he said, Charmaine, you need to explain that. Because for some people reading this book, they've always been able to check more than 1 box. They will not understand what you're saying. So again, it gives me a sense that our identities, our narratives take place in larger cultures that either constrain us or provide opportunities. But I know from my experience as a multiracial person, and my story has been greatly affected by being a first-generation American of my family. My parents, I was born 1 month after my parents arrived here, and received certain messages about what that meant and what it meant to be an American, and what and living in a racialized society in the 1960s. This is when I grew up. The passage of time that allowed me to even think of myself as multiracial. So I would just put that out in terms of part of my story. I know we have about, I think, a few minutes. I'm going to take us towards the 3rd part of the title, which talks about innovating practice. And the book does have a number of chapters in the 3rd section that offer very specific tools that people can use on their campuses. There's models of that can be applied to multiple levels of the campus DEI assessments. There's material that can be used for student retreats that then I believe can be adapted to staff and faculty retreats to explore multiracial experiences. And there's a section that talked about the development of the first ever critical mixed race studies program in the country. And also, I believe there's a chapter that blends art and theory, and gives many examples and I won't say handouts, but pages that can be used, blank pages, after the material is explained by the authors and demonstrated by the artwork of the authors. So there's many ways that the book innovates practice. And I want to just ask Nick and Nelia, in what ways do you want to share with the group in the time that we have left, how either has your work, your life, or your experiences help people in higher education innovate practice?
Nick and I are too polite. We're over here mouthing to each other. You take it, you go ahead. Okay. I would say, oh gosh, I'm just going back to like everything you're saying, and it's taking me back. I'm an 80s baby. So I have like gone from, nothing to dial-up internet to Facebook in college, like the end of college, to where we are now. So I was just thinking of what you're talking about with like forums and all sorts of things. So I think one of the most important things to me is that multiraciality doesn't always need to be seen as a separate thing. As I just quoted in the poem, we're a part of everything. And so when people talk about like, well, how do we change things by simply incorporating into, like, as an educator, incorporate into the current curricula, particularly history, right? Like their anti-miscegenation laws, what did that mean? What was going on? How did that tie into Asian immigration and hate? How did that tie into slavery and the children that resulted from slave masters or from people enslaving other people? I don't want to say slaves, people who were enslaved. How did all that play out where the children were still property, right? Like these are things that need to be taught that are a part of American history. And I think when we try to put it in this other space and say, oh, that's like create a multiracial course or create something else, that's problematic. We need to be including it in our programming. We need to be including it in our imagery, on books, in programs, and really highlighting, like, in activist movements, cross-racial solidarity, right? Like Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, right? These things were happening, they're not new. And we need to remember why they're purposely excluded and why the FBI and other folks fought so hard to infiltrate these movements and to pit each other against one another. So all of a sudden, all these files come out about Richard Aoki, the Asian man that was a Black Panther, saying, he was an informant this whole time. Like, is that true? Is that a ploy to, now, take down this person who was known for interracial solidarity? Also thinking about other folks like the American Indian movement and the connection with the Black Panthers when they had a sit-in, and well, it wasn't meant to be a sit-in takeover. It was just kind of what happened when they got to Washington, D.C. and they were supposed to get a meeting, and were told you aren't getting a meeting, and they needed somewhere to stay. And it was like, oh, now they took over the building. But it was the Panthers and members of the Black community that came and fed them, that supported them, that looked out for their security. So in the times we're in now, unfortunately, we still need to have this type of solidarity to really get at these structures. And those are the sorts of things we need to be highlighting as a part of history in every class. Even in a math course, you could be highlighting a particular person and talk about their background and how that contributed to their involvement in mathematics. So I think that's the most important thing. It's not some huge overhaul. It's just simply including and talking about it.
Nick, do you have something to add, something to share from your experience or from your own work or your work that you've been doing since the book, you wrote your chapter and were a part of the community of the book?
Right. Yes, I was so busy taking notes from what Nalia was saying that I missed my cue. I really resonate with a lot of what Nalia is saying. I think that kind of educating ourselves about these political movements, understanding racial solidarity, and understanding that we're kind of all in the same fight, and we're all kind of moving in the same direction, and thus, need to be aware of each other's narratives is really important. I also think, on the in terms of what people can do in higher education, what I found when I landed on campus was that everything, the vast majority of the ways that I was able to explore my own identity were facilitated by the students around me. And so, like either, the administrations and, student affairs folks and faculty need to kind of, to an extent, like kind of get out of students' ways and allow them to do this work and give them the funding and opportunities that they need. But and then also on the other hand, there's a faculty member, and I believe she might be on this call, Natasha Sharma, who was really formative for me at Northwestern, because what I found her doing routinely was looking at the issues, political and identity-wise, that people were dealing with on college campuses, and informing her curriculum around that, instead of it being around this kind of, I understand that there's, certain standards or certain things that I feel like you just need to know, and you just need to, absorb these things. And that's kind of what it means to be in this teacher-student relationship. But that when people would come into her office and pour their hearts out, and they would, sit in meetings with her, or she would show up to like student rallies and stuff, she would take all of that and she would include that information in these student-driven narratives in coursework and in her syllabi and all these other things, and is really kind of jumping at the bit to be able to do that. I see oftentimes at universities, faculties of color end up being, like advisors, therapists, researchers, book writers, like all of these things all at once. But to also be able to do all those things, and then also to be able to reflect through that work what your students need. I think that you know universities need more faculty like that, and need to be supplying resources for people to be able to receive these narratives. And also, Nalia, just to agree and double down with one of the points you said during the narrative section, about just bringing our whole selves to things as well. I believe I was at this Midwest Mixed conference in Minneapolis a couple years ago, where somebody said, it's not our identities. Our identities are not complicated in and of themselves. White supremacy makes them complicated because we have to figure out how to navigate between all of these structures that are kind of thrown at us, and figure out how to kind of to duck and dodge and weave our way through all of those things. But also that, complexity, which is different from maybe like being complicated, but like complexity is not a bad thing, and we should be able to, sit with and hold all of those things. And if, for me, I identify as Black, part of that is that there's a political identity enmeshed in that as well. The vast majority of the experiences in my life, I think the primary factor in terms of the way that people treat me and meet me is because of my Blackness. And that's part of why I feel like I fit in that, and I fit in part of that, that struggle, but that I feel like I'm a lot more than that. And I feel like a lot of Black people feel like they're a lot more than that. But and then that's why they kind of say, Black is beautiful, and there's all this diversity within Blackness. But that Blackness is that first identity that we get met with. And so if there are opportunities within institutions to be able to have discussions about that political identity and hold that, and allow us to kind of sit in that securely, while also allowing us opportunities to be able to explore all these other aspects of ourselves. A lot of times the reason that I wasn't able to do all these other things on campus was because my Blackness was putting me in situations, or I was being put in situations because of my Blackness, where I was being physically, emotionally exhausted. I was constantly having to deal with an institution that was set up to support white folks. And so I wasn't able to explore all those other aspects of my identity until I came across Mixed and CMRS. And then even then, it felt like I was, not necessarily like splitting myself in half. I think I was able to kind of like be in these two worlds at the same time, but I didn't feel like I was able to explore or even know what it was that I needed from the university, because I was so busy kind of in these battles. So anyways, yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Sorry, go ahead.
Before we, I believe we're moving to question and answer, but so I'm going to call it being in solidarity with the people who are attending. I just want to echo a theme that both of you talked about, is when we innovate practice, I believe we're moving forward in solidarity with other groups. And some of those groups I know that I resisted back in the day. Several years ago, I was trying to, NGOR asked me to do a multiracial caucus group. And this was a good 20 years back. And a whole bunch of people showed up. Some of the folks had multiracial ancestry. Some folks had, quote, monoracial backgrounds, whatever that means. Some folks were transracial adoptees. Some people were white people who had traveled the world. And I remember thinking at the time, what am I supposed to do with this group? Some of these people do not belong here. And I know that my own experience has changed, but I also know that there are other groups who can learn from our experiences, from our knowledge, from our theories, from our lives, from our narratives. And I no longer feel the sense. In fact, towards the end of the book, we talk about some other areas that need to be teased out. What is the role of transracial adoptees, for example, in this discussion? Is one example, but I know that I've changed. And as we innovate practice and move forward, it is, how do we do it in solidarity? How do we do it with in hand with other folks who may or may not be part of our community, but whose experiences will enrich our community, and our knowledge will also help folks find their own place in the world. So I'm going to hand it off to whoever is handling the questions, and that's it.
Oh my gosh, so this has been incredible. I feel like I need to take a deep breath in and out. Wow, this is amazing. Thank you all. We have some fantastic questions coming in. So about 2 minutes per question, if we can do a nice little synopsis per each one. So one of our attendees wants to know how we take ownership of our different racial identities if we've internalized messages that were not fully accepted by either group.
Could you read that last part slowly again? Because I want to make sure I'm
Mhm.
understanding what the person is asking.
Yeah. How do we take ownership of our different racial identities if we've internalized messages that were not fully accepted by either group?
I don't know if this is helpful, but I think I was raised by my mom, who's white, my stepdad, who's white, with a sibling who is their biological child. And so I was the only other person. And in my chapter, I talk a lot about how that was minimized. It was kind of like one of those, my mom might shout it out in a store if it was a Middle Eastern store and she felt uncomfortable. Her dad's from over there. And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? And then when I'm like around folks from the Middle East, it would be like, specifically, my dad is from Turkey, so I'm second generation, but not raised with him, right? And so it would be like, oh, you kind of need to learn the language and this and that. So in my chapter, I talk about finally coming to peace after trying to learn the language for multiple years, that my identity doesn't have a bilingual prerequisite. No matter what anybody says, I am who I am because I am, and I don't care. I don't need to show you my 23andMe. I don't need to, do any of that. I know who I am, and whether or not somebody else wants to acknowledge that, it doesn't change who I am. But it took a long time to get to that point, because I totally get where you're coming from, where people make you feel like they reject your identity. And it's like, do I keep, asserting this identity that's not accepted and just go along with what everyone else says? Like, why don't you just pass? I mean, you can, even on the census, you can check white. So why? And I'm like, that's part of the problem. That's like the melting pot ideology. That's the passing. That's not challenging white supremacy. That's flying with it, And so it took a lot of self-work to just come to this point where it's like, I am who I am, not based on others' responses to how they perceive me.
Woo, am I going to cry?
Yeah.
All right, so we have another question.
Can I add one piece to that very quickly? And I notice this a lot with younger multiracial scholars. Folks doubt themselves a lot. Is this the right work? Is this, so is it right? Am I enough? And I don't want to minimize that at all. If that's people's experiences, that's people's experiences. And then how can I support you, or how can you get support to work through that? And it will be a lifelong process. But maybe it's just age, or maybe it's just personality. But I really don't care. I really don't. And I can say that in loving ways, and I can say that in more forceful ways. But the idea of what we internalize is our responsibility. I know it's all around us. Just because it's all around us, we can contest it. We can choose to be who we are. And maybe, like I said, maybe it's just a personality thing. But I want to encourage multiracial to doubt themselves. And multiracial scholars who doubt themselves, tap into the strength and be yourself. So.
Awesome, thank you. I'm also curious if we have any suggestions how to address monoracism with other marginalized and oppressed racial groups.
So I'm translating that to basically when someone of a quote monoracial group, again, the wording is complicated for me, when folks are enacting monoracism against multiracial folks, how should we address that? Okay, I'm going to step back and let my either or both of my two friends here perhaps take that on, unless.
Yeah, I can take a small stab at this question. I think oftentimes um, what I have to constantly remind myself of is the kind of the various intersecting systems of oppression that are kind of ever present in even within Black communities, experiencing a degree of trying to figure out where I fit in, or maybe I also see there's a question about uh, maybe like gatekeeping or like not being Black enough and all of these things. I think first of all, taking a step back and just realizing that it wasn't Black people that carved up the world into these different like racial groups of people, and a lot of times what they're doing is this is a response to kind of a white supremacist world around folks, where they have to kind of think on these terms, and reminding myself of that, and reminding myself of the ways that I've also internalized monoracism, or I think I have a very loose grasp on that concept, but um, the idea of these racial groups kind of being inscribed in this kind of permanent fashion, I need to remind myself of the ways that happens within me too, and I think that it allows me to extend people a whole lot of grace, and I think that also allows, I think, like Charmaine was saying, that there's a degree of like I have to, these things affect me, but I also have to be kind of solid enough in my own identity to realize that you know yeah, I can't let this kind of outside world be 100% of what dictates my sense of identity and my sense of self-worth and my sense of belonging. And when I kind of lose this idea of having to be Black enough and then enter Black spaces, I'm very rarely ever met with folks telling me that I don't belong there. Oftentimes it's kind of an equation of how much this other person is like questioning me, but also how much I'm questioning myself and like buying into this um, as well. And so when I kind of walk in confidence and walk, securely in my own identity, I find I run into a lot less issues.
Thank you so much. We are moving to our next question. What are some suggestions for advocacy related to multiracial issues and concerns?
Well, mine, speaking specifically for MENA folks, support us, get our little checkbox on the census. And also doing that work to get our colleges, like, let's not have to wait until the next census. I mean, obviously we got to wait till the next census to try to get funding and get disaggregated, quote unquote, officially through the structures that are here. But we can start doing that now. We can start doing programming. We can start talking about it. I'm super excited to see some people in the chat, like my colleague and I, we have all these ideas, right, for programming, talking about it in your classrooms, including as part of Asian history. And again, it gets a little complex because I know people are like, North Africa isn't Asia. So yes, there's even further complexity there, how they got rolled in with us, right? And then that Arabs, all Middle Eastern people are not Arab, further complications, right? So talking about these things and seeing if we can get our colleges to make moves before the government does. Like if we're sitting around waiting on the government, we're going to be waiting a long time. So specifically for my community, that's one thing you could do, is support those efforts. A lot of people have been leading them for a very long time. There's a book called The Whitewashing. I will find it and put it in the chat. I'm going to let someone else talk real quick while I find it.
I think in higher ed spaces, I encourage folks to consider everything from a perspective of a multiracial people, because we oftentimes don't carry that awareness. What assumptions am I making about, for example, policies and procedures? Who's listed and who's not? Well, the categories, obviously, in terms of how we collect data. When we do research, how do we decide who's in and who's out? How do we use the data that people provide around issues of race? I also have found in my own consulting practice and just experiences that people focus on multiracial students. And as a multiracial person who was a staff and faculty member back in the day, we have to remember that our colleagues, if we're working in higher education, there are a sizable number of multiracial people on campus now. And what policies, procedures, formal and informal culture affirms their presence, affirms their diversity, affirms their liminality. They may identify different ways in different spaces. Is a way to just consider that, you know, in what ways do we welcome people? In what ways do we keep people out, even inadvertently? Who gets invited to what conferences, what informal gatherings? What do we expect people? Who do we expect them to be when they show up? And so that's one way, I think, in terms of advocacy. But also, the book has several chapters that talk about specific DEI efforts across the spectrum. So I'll mention that too. But the idea of just even personally think about who's left in and who's left out in policies and procedures, and just even general culture. Who's reflected and who's not at the staff, faculty, and student level. That is kind of general, but I will offer that.
Yes, very important. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has a hard stop on the hour. But there are so many fantastic questions in here. One, if we could just fit it in the next 5 minutes. How do we navigate folks questioning identities with the intersection of academics coming out as like mixed fishing or lying about their identity? You're on mute.
Okay, say that one more time. They said, how do we what for those folks?
Navigate people questioning identities with, in recent history, a lot of academics being like called out for lying that they're BIPOC.
Yeah, I see someone in the chat. Yeah, you're talking about how Rachel Dolezal made your life a million times harder. I know. I'm like the person that carries around the picture of my dad. Like, do I really have to like pop this out? Because even if we're side by side, people are like, you know, they're like, how do y'all connect, right? I don't know how we, gosh, I don't know how we, I guess the way we address it is to keep calling it out in one respect, right? But it is so hard because you also don't want to do that to somebody that is multiracial, right? And so I don't have a good answer to this. I think it just further complicates things. But most of all, what is really problematic to me is that what has been said about many of these people, a lot of them are in academia. A lot of them have been women and taking spaces that were slotted for other folks. And then I've also heard that they tend to talk down and very condescending and negative to the people whose racial identities they're imitating or pretending to be, or stereotyping, that a lot of the identity that they perform is very stereotype trope type versions of the identities. And so like the lawyer that was taking up, you know, spots for Latina lawyers. So I think that is the biggest issue to me, that they are still, that they're actually pretending to be someone else, and it's still all a part of white supremacy. So like, what in their head is teaching them that this is allyship or accomplishship? I don't know. That's I don't know. Maybe Nick or Charmaine has something.
Just briefly on that, this is, I think, when we get into these conversations, this is when I'm reminded of the idea that, you know, dismantling white supremacy will help white folks as well, in the same way that dismantling patriarchy will help men, and all of these other systems. Deconstructing them helps to help support the folks who are deploying these kind of like structures of power against other folks. I think that what that highlights is like a fundamental I mean, it's people wanting to be a part of a culture that is not their own, because the history of their own culture had like it's incredibly complicated, and it involves you know, I think you know, when I look at like Rachel Dolezal, like she wanted to be part of the Black community and didn't feel like, and if you read like interviews with her, didn't feel like white people had a culture that she could be a part of or that she identified with or any of those things. And so she kind of made herself into all of these, you know, caricatures of Blackness that she would eventually be able to kind of fit in. And at once understanding that these things are symptoms of white supremacy, like the idea that you can kind of like slip your way into these faculty positions and then talk down to folks of the racial group that you're kind of like imitating. That is, you know, reinscribing white supremacy, but and then also the fact that you look into yourself and you want to be something other than who you are, that's something that's white supremacist as well. And I think that's something that I hear a lot before people kind of get the language around like multiraciality. I hear that coming up a lot. And so I'm not 100% sure how to stop that, because, you know, I want to prevent myself from being like identity police or anything like that. But I think that, you know, understanding people in their like fullest narrative, like going back to this narrative thing, like being able to hold people in their full narratives, maybe people start to think of themselves as enough if they're able to communicate those things. And so that's maybe a gentle way for them.
And I know we're out of time. I'll offer 2 sentences. Choice is an interesting topic. If we get to choose, why don't they? And I would encourage people to just say, and where does power and privilege reside in that conversation? So as a way of responding, because I believe that power and privilege and history has a big part in that. And as Nick said too, there are other factors on why people do that. But and I also know that Mark Johnson Guerrero is exploring this topic in a forthcoming book chapter about choice. But choice is an interesting thing. So and the idea that oftentimes people in the dominant groups want to see themselves in other people's stuff. So it's like I used to use the thought of Me Too before the Me Too movement arose. If you can do it, why, you know, where do I, as someone from the dominant group, I always have to be a part of that. So if you can choose, it has to be related to me too, because I am so used to being part of everything, as opposed to stepping back and saying, I have been invested in certain powers and privileges, and there may be parts of communities that I do not share the same option for. So I will leave it at that.
Whew, this has been so powerful. And even in our comment section, I've been getting a lot of my heart filled from that. So presenters, round of applause virtually. We do unfortunately have to wrap up. This has been so beautiful. Everyone follow Critical Mixed Race Studies on our website, on our Instagram. You can stay up to date with when we have another book talk coming, our conference that will also be virtual, and we'll get to have more of this community. So again, presenters, thank you for showing up, bringing your full selves and really being in community with us. We really appreciate it. Yes, the recording will be available later.
Okay, so